Welcome to Night Crime Stories. Tonight, we examine the case of Richard Ramirez, the night stalker who terrorized Los Angeles in the summer of 1985. His reign of brutal home invasions left an entire city sleeping with the lights on. Settle in, turn off the lights, and let the case unfold. Night Crime Stories. Target runtime, 90 to 120 minutes. Maintain a steady, investigative tone throughout. This is a story of persistence, mystery, and ultimate resolution spanning nearly 7 decades. The pacing should reflect the methodical nature of cold case investigation work. Use pauses effectively to allow listeners to absorb the weight of time and the persistence required to solve this case. The tone should be respectful to the victims while maintaining the investigative atmosphere that defines quality true crime narration. In the depths of the Columbia River Gorge, where ancient waters carve through basalt cliffs and time seems to move differently than in the world above, secrets can remain hidden for generations. The river keeps its mysteries well, holding them close in the darkness beneath its flowing surface, waiting for the right moment, the right person, to bring truth back to the light. Tonight, we journey into one of the longest-running missing persons cases in Oregon history. A story that began on a December evening in 1958, when a family of 5 made a decision to take a drive through one of the Pacific Northwest's most beautiful and treacherous landscapes. It's a story that would span nearly 7 decades, involving multiple generations of investigators, searchers, and ultimately, a dedicated diver who refused to let the river keep its secrets any longer. This is not just a story about a missing family. It's about the persistence of human curiosity, the advancement of forensic science, and the way that some mysteries demand to be solved, no matter how much time passes. It's about the Columbia River Gorge, a place of stunning beauty that has claimed many lives over the decades, and the dedicated professionals who work tirelessly to bring closure to families who have waited generations for answers. December 7, 1958. Portland, Oregon was settling into the winter rhythm that defines the Pacific Northwest. Rain drummed steadily against windows, and the shortened days cast long shadows through the evergreen forests that surrounded the growing city. For most families, it was an ordinary Sunday evening, a time for quiet dinners and early preparations for the week ahead. But for Kenneth Martin, his wife Barbara Jean, and their 3 daughters, this December evening would mark the beginning of one of Oregon's most enduring mysteries. Kenneth Martin was 54 years old, a man who had lived through the Great Depression and World War II, someone who understood both hardship and the importance of family. His wife, Barbara Jean, at 48, was the cornerstone of their household, managing the complex logistics of raising 3 daughters in the 1950s. Their daughters represented the hope and promise of post-war America. Virginia and Susan, the older girls, were navigating their teenage years with all the complexity that entailed in the late 50s. But it was their youngest daughter, Barbara, nicknamed Barbie, who at 14 embodied the youthful optimism that characterized the era. She was at that precious age where childhood wonder still competed with emerging independence. The Martin family lived in Portland, but like many Pacific Northwest residents, they were drawn to the natural beauty that surrounded their urban environment. The Columbia River Gorge, carved over millennia by the massive river that forms the border between Oregon and Washington, offered some of the most spectacular scenery in the region. Waterfalls cascaded from impossible heights, ancient forests clung to steep canyon walls, and the river itself promised both beauty and recreation. On that December evening, Kenneth and Barbara made a decision that seemed perfectly reasonable at the time. They would take their family for a drive to the Columbia River Gorge in Hood River County. It was the kind of family excursion that defined American leisure in the 1950s, a chance to see the natural wonders that existed just beyond the city limits, to spend time together as a family unit that was becoming increasingly central to American identity. The neighbors would later remember the conversation clearly. The Martins had mentioned their plans, described their intention to drive out to the gorge, perhaps to see the winter landscape, to experience the raw power of the Columbia River during the rainy season. It was not an unusual destination. Thousands of families made similar trips throughout the year, drawn by the scenic beauty and the sense of adventure that came with exploring the dramatic landscape. What made this particular trip different was what happened next. Or rather, what didn't happen? The Martin family simply vanished. They loaded into their car, said goodbye to their neighbors, and drove into a mystery that would persist for nearly 7 decades. The initial response to their disappearance followed the typical pattern of missing persons cases in the 1950s. When the family failed to return home, concern began to mount among friends and neighbors. Phone calls were made, relatives were contacted, and gradually, the understanding dawned that something was seriously wrong. Local law enforcement was notified, and the investigation began with the methodical approach that characterized police work in that era. Officers interviewed the neighbors who had spoken with the family before their departure. They verified the intended destination and began to trace the most likely routes the family would have taken from Portland to the Columbia River Gorge. The Columbia River Highway, now known as the historic Columbia River Highway, was the primary route for travelers heading to the gorge. Built in the early 20th century as one of America's first scenic highways, it wound through the dramatic landscape with a series of curves and elevation changes that showcased the area's natural beauty while presenting significant challenges for drivers, particularly during winter conditions. In December 1958, the road conditions would have been challenging. Winter rains made the pavement slick, and visibility could be reduced by fog and mist rising from the river. The combination of challenging driving conditions and unfamiliar territory created numerous possibilities for what might have happened to the Martin family. The initial search efforts focused on the most obvious scenarios. Had the family's car broken down somewhere along the route? Had they gotten lost on one of the many side roads that branched off from the main highway? Were they stranded somewhere, waiting for help that hadn't yet arrived? Search teams began systematic coverage of the area, focusing on the main routes and the most likely places where a family might have encountered difficulty. The terrain of the Columbia River Gorge made searching challenging. The landscape was characterized by steep slopes, dense forest, and numerous tributaries and side canyons where a vehicle could potentially become hidden from casual observation. Days passed, then weeks, and still there was no sign of the Martin family. The search expanded, involving more personnel and covering wider areas. Local media began covering the story, appealing to the public for any information about the missing family. Tips came in, as they always do in high-profile missing persons cases, but none led to any concrete discoveries. As winter deepened and moved toward spring, the search efforts began to take on a more somber tone. The initial hope that the family might be found alive and well gradually gave way to the growing recognition that something tragic had likely occurred. The question was no longer whether the family was safe, but rather what had happened to them and where they might be found. The winter of 1958 gave way to spring 1959, and with the changing seasons came the first breakthrough in the Martin family case. But it was a breakthrough that would bring more sorrow than relief, more questions than answers. In the spring of 1959, approximately 6 months after the family had disappeared, the bodies of 2 of the Martin daughters, Virginia and Susan, were discovered downstream in the Columbia River. The discovery was both a moment of terrible confirmation and the beginning of even deeper mysteries. The recovery of Virginia and Susan's bodies provided investigators with their first concrete evidence of what had likely happened to the Martin family. The fact that the girls were found in the river strongly suggested that the family's vehicle had somehow ended up in the water. This theory aligned with what many investigators had suspected from the beginning, given the challenging driving conditions and the proximity of the Columbia River Highway to the water in many locations. However, the discovery of the 2 girls also raised immediate and troubling questions. Where were Kenneth, Barbara Jean, and 14-year-old Barbie? If the entire family had been in a vehicle that had gone into the river, why had only 2 of the 5 family members been recovered? The Columbia River is a massive waterway, one of the largest rivers in North America. Its flow patterns, seasonal variations, and the complex geography of the gorge create conditions where objects and remains can be dispersed over great distances. It was entirely possible that the other 3 family members had been carried to different locations, or that they remained with the vehicle wherever it had come to rest on the river bottom. Teams of divers were brought in to search areas of the river that seemed most likely based on the location where Virginia and Susan had been found. The underwater environment of the Columbia River presented significant challenges. The water was often murky, making visibility poor. Strong currents made diving dangerous and limited the time that could be spent underwater. The river bottom was complex, with rocks, fallen trees, and accumulated debris creating numerous places where a vehicle could become hidden or trapped. Despite extensive searching efforts throughout 1959 and into 1960, no trace of the family's vehicle was found. No additional remains were recovered. The case began to take on the characteristics of a cold case, though investigators never formally closed the file. The Martin family disappearance became one of those mysteries that haunted the local law enforcement community, a case that older officers would mention to newer colleagues, a reminder of the cases that never quite get solved. For the extended family and friends of the Martins, the partial resolution brought by finding Virginia and Susan was both a blessing and a curse. They now knew that something terrible had indeed happened to the family, but they were left without closure regarding Kenneth, Barbara Jean, and Barbie. The uncertainty was in many ways worse than not knowing anything at all. The case became part of the folklore of the Columbia River Gorge. Local residents and regular visitors to the area knew the story of the missing family. Over the years, various amateur searchers and interested individuals would occasionally look for signs of the missing vehicle, but the Columbia River kept its secrets well. As the 1960s progressed into the 1970s and beyond, investigative techniques evolved significantly. New technologies for underwater searching were developed. Sonar systems became more sophisticated. Diving equipment improved, allowing for longer and deeper underwater investigations. Periodically, law enforcement agencies would revisit the Martin case, applying new techniques to try to locate the missing vehicle and the 3 remaining family members. Each technological advance brought renewed hope that the case might finally be solved. Sonar surveys were conducted at various times over the decades, searching areas of the river that seemed most likely based on the available evidence. However, the Columbia River's size and complexity, combined with decades of sediment accumulation and changes to the river bottom, made these searches extraordinarily challenging. The case also became a touchstone for discussions about river safety in the Pacific Northwest. The Columbia River Gorge, while spectacularly beautiful, has always been a dangerous environment. The combination of challenging weather conditions, difficult terrain, and the proximity of roads to steep drops and deep water has resulted in numerous accidents over the decades. Safety improvements were made to the Columbia River Highway over the years, including better guardrails, improved signage, and enhanced road maintenance. But the Martin case served as a reminder that even with these improvements, the natural environment of the gorge remained inherently dangerous, particularly during winter conditions. As the decades passed, the Martin case transitioned from an active investigation to a historical mystery. New generations of law enforcement officers would learn about the case during their training and orientation to the region. The story was passed down through the institutional memory of local police and sheriff's departments, a reminder of the cases that shaped their understanding of the challenges involved in search and rescue operations in the Columbia River Gorge. By the 1980s and 1990s, the case had achieved a kind of legendary status among those interested in unsolved mysteries. True crime enthusiasts and amateur investigators would periodically research the case, sometimes proposing new theories or suggesting areas that might warrant additional searching. However, without significant new evidence or technological breakthroughs, the case remained effectively stalled. As the Martin family case moved through its second and third decades, it became a study in the evolution of search and rescue techniques, the persistence of dedicated investigators, and the way that unsolved cases can become woven into the fabric of a community's identity. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, periodic searches were conducted using the best available technology of each era. Early sonar systems, primitive by today's standards but revolutionary at the time, were deployed in systematic sweeps of areas where the Martin family vehicle was thought most likely to rest. These searches required careful coordination between law enforcement agencies, volunteer dive teams, and equipment operators. The challenge of searching the Columbia River cannot be overstated. The river system in the gorge area includes not only the main channel but also numerous side channels, backwaters, and areas where the topography has changed over time due to natural processes and human intervention. Dam construction and modification over the decades had altered water flow patterns and sediment deposition, potentially moving or burying objects that had been on the river bottom for years. Each search effort brought its own set of discoveries, though none related to the Martin family. The river bottom yielded a catalogue of human activity spanning decades, abandoned vehicles from various time periods, lost equipment, and occasionally, remains related to other incidents. Each discovery required investigation to determine whether it might be connected to the Martin case, a process that often consumed significant time and resources while ultimately leading nowhere. The investigative techniques applied to the Martin case evolved significantly during these decades. Computer modeling became available to analyze river flow patterns and predict where objects entering the water at various points might ultimately come to rest. These models, while imperfect, provided investigators with more sophisticated tools for prioritizing search areas. Photography and documentation techniques also improved dramatically. Earlier searches had relied on basic sketches and written descriptions to record locations that had been investigated. By the 1980s and 1990s, comprehensive photographic documentation and GPS mapping allowed for much more precise record-keeping, ensuring that search efforts could be efficiently coordinated and that areas wouldn't be unnecessarily researched. The case attracted attention from various specialized organizations as they developed. Underwater recovery specialists, volunteer dive teams with specific expertise in vehicle recovery, and organizations focused on cold cases all took interest in the Martin family disappearance at various times. Each brought their own perspective and techniques to the challenge of locating the missing vehicle. One significant development during this period was the growing understanding of how vehicles behave when submerged in river environments. Research conducted in connection with various cases around the country provided insights into the factors that influence where a vehicle will come to rest after entering water, how it might move over time due to current and sediment action, and the conditions under which it might become completely buried. This research suggested that the Martin family vehicle, if it had indeed entered the Columbia River in 1958, might have traveled a considerable distance from the point of entry before coming to rest. Furthermore, decades of sediment accumulation could have completely buried the vehicle, making it undetectable even with sonar systems unless searchers knew exactly where to look. The psychological aspects of long-term missing persons cases also became better understood during this period. The extended Martin family, friends, and community members affected by the disappearance experienced a form of ambiguous loss that made grieving and moving forward particularly difficult. Support groups and counseling resources were eventually developed to help people cope with the unique challenges of cases where closure remained elusive. Media coverage of the case evolved as well. In the early years, local newspapers had covered the disappearance and initial search efforts with the straightforward reporting style typical of the era. As decades passed and the case achieved a kind of legendary status, it became the subject of feature articles, retrospective pieces, and eventually, coverage in true crime publications and early internet forums. This media attention served multiple purposes. It kept the case in public awareness, occasionally generating new tips or theories from members of the public. It also maintained pressure on law enforcement agencies to continue periodic search efforts and to apply new technologies as they became available. However, media coverage also sometimes led to sensationalized theories or claims that complicated the investigation. Amateur investigators began to take an active interest in the case during the 1980s and 1990s. These individuals, often retired professionals with backgrounds in law enforcement, engineering, or related fields, would spend their own time researching the case, analyzing maps and photographs, and sometimes conducting their own informal searches of areas they thought might be promising. The case also became a training tool for various professional organizations. Search and rescue teams used the Martin case as an example when training new members about the challenges of long-term missing persons cases and the importance of maintaining detailed records over extended periods. Dive teams studied the case to understand the complexities of underwater vehicle recovery in river environments. Technological developments in the 1990s brought new hope to the case. Side-scan sonar systems became more sophisticated and more widely available. These systems could create detailed images of river bottom topography, potentially revealing objects that might not be detected by simpler sonar systems. GPS technology also became more precise and more affordable, allowing for much more accurate mapping of search areas. Despite these technological advances, the fundamental challenge remained unchanged. The Columbia River system in the gorge area encompasses an enormous volume of water and covers a vast area. Even with sophisticated equipment, systematic searching of the entire area where the Martin vehicle might conceivably have ended up would require resources far beyond what was available for any single case. As the Martin family case entered its fourth decade, a new chapter began to unfold. The development of more accessible diving technology, the growth of recreational diving communities, and the emergence of individuals dedicated to solving cold cases began to change the dynamics of the search for the missing family. Independent searchers, individuals who took on cold cases as personal missions, began to play an increasingly important role in missing persons investigations across the country. These searchers often brought a level of dedication and persistence that was difficult for official agencies to maintain over decades. While law enforcement agencies had to balance resources among numerous active cases, independent searchers could focus intensively on single cases that captured their interest. The Martin case attracted the attention of several such individuals over the years. These searchers typically began by conducting exhaustive research into the existing evidence, interviewing anyone still alive who had been connected to the original investigation, and developing their own theories about where the family's vehicle might be located. One of the challenges faced by independent searchers was gaining access to the detailed information that law enforcement agencies had accumulated over the decades. While some information was publicly available, much of the investigative file remained confidential. However, persistent researchers often found ways to piece together comprehensive pictures of the case through public records, newspaper archives, and interviews with retired investigators who were willing to share their recollections. The Columbia River Gorge presented unique challenges for independent searchers. Unlike some bodies of water where vehicle recovery had been successful, the Columbia River system was vast, deep in many areas, and subject to strong currents that made diving dangerous. Independent searchers needed to be highly skilled and well-equipped to operate safely in this environment. During the 1990s and 2000s, several independent searchers conducted their own investigations into the Martin case. These efforts typically involved detailed analysis of maps and historical photographs, interviews with longtime local residents who might remember details about conditions in 1958, and systematic searching of areas that seemed promising based on their research. Some independent searchers focused on areas that had not been thoroughly investigated during official searches. They reasoned that law enforcement agencies, operating under resource constraints and official protocols, might have overlooked locations that seemed less obvious but were still plausible based on the available evidence. The rise of Internet communication revolutionized the way independent searchers could collaborate and share information. Online forums dedicated to cold cases allowed researchers from around the country to share theories, compare notes, and coordinate their efforts. The Martin case was discussed extensively in these forums, with participants analyzing everything from historical weather patterns to the mechanical characteristics of 1950s automobiles. However, the involvement of multiple independent searchers also created coordination challenges. Different individuals often developed conflicting theories about where the vehicle might be located, leading to duplicated effort and occasional conflicts over search priorities and methods. The emergence of more sophisticated underwater metal detection equipment in the 2000s opened new possibilities for searching. These systems could potentially detect metallic objects buried under sediment that might not be visible to sonar systems. However, the Columbia River's environment presented challenges for metal detection as well, including interference from natural mineral deposits and debris from decades of human activity. Independent searchers also began to apply advances in computer modeling and geographic information systems to the Martin case. These tools allowed for more sophisticated analysis of factors such as historical water flow patterns, sediment deposition rates, and the probable paths that objects might have taken after entering the river at various points. Some of the most promising work done by independent searchers involved detailed analysis of historical records to identify locations where vehicles had previously been recovered from the Columbia River. By studying these cases, researchers could develop better understanding of the factors that influenced where vehicles came to rest and the conditions under which they might remain detectable over long periods. The dedication of independent searchers was often remarkable. Some individuals spent years researching the case, investing their own money in equipment and travel, and dedicating countless hours to searching areas they believed might yield results. Their motivation was typically a combination of genuine desire to provide closure to the affected families and personal fascination with solving complex mysteries. One particularly significant development during this period was the growing recognition that successful vehicle recovery from river environments often required not just sophisticated equipment, but also intimate knowledge of local conditions and considerable persistence. Vehicles that had been submerged for decades might be detectable only under very specific circumstances, requiring searchers to return to the same areas multiple times under different conditions. The seasonal variations in the Columbia River also influenced search strategies. Water levels varied significantly throughout the year, and these variations could affect both the visibility conditions for divers and the effectiveness of various detection technologies. Independent searchers began to coordinate their efforts with seasonal patterns, focusing intensive search periods during times when conditions were most favorable. As the case moved through the 2000s and into the 2010s, independent searchers had investigated numerous locations throughout the Columbia River Gorge area. While none of these efforts had yet located the Martin family vehicle, they had systematically eliminated many possible locations and had developed increasingly sophisticated understanding of where the vehicle was most likely to be found. The work of independent searchers also contributed to broader understanding of cold case methodology and the challenges involved in long-term missing persons investigations. Their experiences, both successes and failures, provided valuable lessons for others working on similar cases around the country. In November 2024, 66 years after the Martin family disappeared into the Columbia River Gorge, a breakthrough finally came from an unexpected source. Archer Mayo, an independent diver who had dedicated himself to solving cold cases involving submerged vehicles, made a discovery that would finally begin to provide answers to one of Oregon's longest-running mysteries. Archer Mayo represented a new generation of independent searchers who combined traditional investigative techniques with modern technology and an almost obsessive dedication to solving specific cases. Mayo had spent years researching the Martin family disappearance, studying every piece of available evidence, analyzing historical maps and photographs, and developing theories about where the family's vehicle might have come to rest. Mayo's approach to the case was methodical and comprehensive. Rather than simply diving in areas that seemed obvious, he conducted extensive research into the historical conditions that existed in December 1958. He studied weather records, water level data, and road conditions to develop a detailed understanding of what the Martin family would have encountered on their final journey. This research led Mayo to focus on areas that had not been extensively searched during previous efforts. His analysis suggested that the vehicle might have ended up in locations that were not immediately obvious, perhaps in areas where it could have become trapped or buried over the decades. Mayo's diving techniques also reflected advances in equipment and methodology that had occurred since earlier search efforts. He used sophisticated underwater metal detection equipment, high-resolution underwater cameras, and advanced dive computers that allowed him to spend more time underwater and operate more safely in challenging conditions. The discovery in November 2024 came during one of Mayo's systematic searches of an area he had identified as promising based on his research. Using side-scan sonar to survey the river bottom, Mayo detected an anomaly that warranted closer investigation. The sonar signature suggested a large metallic object buried in sediment, in a location that aligned with his theories about where the Martin vehicle might have come to rest. When Mayo dove to investigate the anomaly, he found a vehicle submerged and inverted in what he described as a pit underwater. The vehicle was extensively buried in decades of accumulated sediment, which explained why it had remained undetected despite numerous previous search efforts. Only a portion of the vehicle was accessible, and even that required careful excavation to expose. The condition of the vehicle presented both opportunities and challenges for investigation. The fact that it was buried had protected it from some of the effects of being submerged for nearly 70 years, potentially preserving evidence that might otherwise have been lost. However, the burial also made the vehicle extremely difficult to access and examine. Mayo immediately contacted law enforcement agencies to report his discovery. The Hood River County Sheriff's Office, which had maintained jurisdiction over the case, responded to coordinate the investigation and recovery efforts. The discovery was treated with appropriate caution, as there was no immediate way to confirm that this was indeed the Martin family vehicle, though the location and circumstances strongly suggested that it was. Initial investigation of the site confirmed that the vehicle was indeed from the appropriate time period and appeared to match descriptions of the Martin family's car. However, the extent of burial and deterioration meant that definitive identification would require extensive recovery and examination efforts. The discovery represented vindication for Mayo's research methodology and persistence. His success demonstrated the value of combining thorough historical research with modern diving techniques and sophisticated equipment. It also illustrated how advances in technology and technique could potentially solve cases that had remained mysterious for decades. However, the discovery also marked the beginning of a new phase of challenges. Recovering a vehicle that had been buried under sediment for nearly 70 years would require specialized equipment and careful planning. The location of the vehicle, in deep water with strong currents, made recovery operations inherently dangerous and complex. The significance of Mayo's discovery extended beyond just the Martin family case. His success provided proof of concept for other cold case investigators and demonstrated that even cases that had been unsolved for decades might still yield to persistence and improved methodology. For the extended Martin family, Mayo's discovery represented both long-awaited progress and the beginning of what would hopefully be final closure. Family members who had lived their entire lives without knowing the fate of Kenneth, Barbara Jean, and Barbie now had reason to hope that answers might finally be forthcoming. The discovery also posed new questions about the circumstances of the family's disappearance. While the location of the vehicle provided important clues about what had happened, many details about the family's final journey remained mysterious. Investigators would need to examine the vehicle and any preserved evidence to develop a more complete understanding of the events of December 7, 1958. Mayo's breakthrough demonstrated the continuing evolution of cold case investigation techniques and the important role that dedicated independent researchers could play in solving long-standing mysteries. His success with the Martin case would likely inspire other independent searchers and provide a model for approaching similar cases in the future. The discovery of what appeared to be the Martin family vehicle in November 2024 marked the beginning of one of the most challenging recovery operations in Oregon's investigative history. The circumstances that had kept the vehicle hidden for nearly 70 years, its deep burial in river sediment and its location in a dangerous underwater environment, also made its recovery extraordinarily difficult. Recovery operations began in March 2025, approximately 4 months after Mayo's initial discovery. The delay reflected the complexity of planning and organizing an operation to recover a heavily buried vehicle from the bottom of the Columbia River. Multiple agencies needed to be coordinated, specialized equipment had to be obtained, and safety protocols had to be developed for working in the challenging underwater environment. The Hood River County Sheriff's Office took the lead in coordinating the recovery effort, working with state agencies, specialized recovery contractors, and diving experts. The operation required careful planning to address both the technical challenges of vehicle recovery and the evidentiary requirements of what was still being treated as a potential crime scene. The location where Mayo had found the vehicle presented multiple challenges for recovery operations. The water was deep enough to require specialized diving equipment and procedures. Strong currents in the area made diving dangerous and limited the amount of time that could be safely spent underwater. The vehicle's burial under decades of sediment meant that extensive excavation would be required before recovery could even be attempted. The first phase of the recovery operation involved more detailed documentation and investigation of the site. Divers worked to carefully excavate around the vehicle to better understand its condition and orientation. Underwater photography and videography documented every aspect of the scene before any recovery attempts were made. This documentation phase revealed the extent of the challenges involved in recovery. The vehicle was not simply resting on the river bottom, but was deeply embedded in consolidated sediment that had accumulated over decades. The inversion of the vehicle, with the roof facing down, had created a situation where the passenger compartment was completely filled with sediment and debris. Specialized excavation equipment had to be brought to the site to remove sediment from around the vehicle. This work was conducted underwater by experienced commercial divers, using techniques adapted from marine construction and underwater archaeology. The excavation had to be conducted carefully to avoid damaging the vehicle or disturbing potential evidence. As excavation progressed, it became clear that the vehicle had suffered significant deterioration during its decades underwater. The metal body had corroded extensively, and many components had separated or collapsed. However, the basic structure remained intact enough to confirm that this was indeed a vehicle from the appropriate time period and of the type that would match the Martin family's car. The recovery team faced a critical decision about how to proceed with the actual lifting of the vehicle. Traditional recovery methods, using cranes and lifting cables, risked catastrophic structural failure of the corroded vehicle. If the vehicle broke apart during lifting, important evidence could be lost and the recovery operation could become even more complicated. A specialized crane capable of operating in the river environment was brought to the site. The crane was positioned on a barge that could be anchored in the river, providing a stable platform for lifting operations. However, the crane operators and diving teams had to work together to develop rigging systems that would distribute lifting forces across the vehicle's remaining structural elements. The first lifting attempts revealed the extent of the vehicle's deterioration. When lifting forces were applied, portions of the vehicle's body separated from the main structure. The recovery team was able to secure the vehicle's frame and some major components, but significant portions of the body and many smaller parts remained on the river bottom. This partial recovery presented investigators with a difficult choice. They could attempt additional recovery operations to retrieve the remaining parts, or they could conclude the recovery phase and focus on examining what had been successfully lifted. The decision was complicated by safety concerns, as the diving operations in the strong currents were inherently dangerous, and by resource limitations, as the specialized equipment and personnel required for the operation were extremely expensive. After consultation with experts in underwater recovery and forensic investigation, the decision was made to conclude the lifting operations. The portions of the vehicle that had been recovered included the frame, engine block, and other major components that were most likely to provide useful information about the circumstances of the accident and any evidence that might remain. The recovered vehicle components were transported to a secure facility where they could be examined under controlled conditions. Forensic experts, automotive specialists, and other investigators began the painstaking process of examining every aspect of the recovered materials. However, the recovery operation was not yet complete. While the major lifting operations had concluded, the question remained of whether any human remains might still be present either in the recovered vehicle components or in the material that remained on the river bottom. This question would require additional investigation and potentially additional recovery efforts. The partial nature of the recovery operation highlighted the ongoing challenges involved in underwater vehicle recovery after extended periods of submersion. While significant progress had been made in locating and partially recovering the Martin family vehicle, many questions remained about what additional information might be obtained through further investigation. The recovery operation also demonstrated the evolution of techniques and technologies available for such operations. Compared to the capabilities that had existed in the 1950s and 1960s, when the case was first investigated, the 2025 recovery operation employed sophisticated diving equipment, precision lifting machinery, and comprehensive documentation methods that provided investigators with far better tools for extracting maximum information from the discovery. For the investigators working on the Martin case, the partial recovery represented significant progress while also highlighting the continuing challenges involved in solving a case that was nearly 70 years old. The recovered vehicle components would require extensive analysis, but they provided the first concrete physical evidence related to the family's disappearance since the discovery of Virginia and Susan's remains in 1959. While the partial recovery of the Martin family vehicle in March 2025 represented a major breakthrough in the case, the most critical questions remained unanswered. Where were the remains of Kenneth, Barbara Jean, and 14-year-old Barbie Martin? The recovery of the vehicle frame and major components had not yielded any immediate evidence of human remains, leaving investigators to plan additional search efforts. The challenge of locating remains that had been submerged for nearly 70 years was formidable. Unlike the metal components of the vehicle, which were relatively durable and detectable with appropriate equipment, human remains in a river environment undergo significant changes over extended periods. The combination of water action, sediment movement, and biological processes meant that remains might have been dispersed, buried, or degraded beyond easy detection. However, investigators had several factors working in their favor. The fact that the vehicle had been deeply buried in sediment suggested that the immediate area around the crash site had been relatively stable over the decades. If remains had been trapped in or around the vehicle when it initially came to rest, they might have been preserved in the sediment layers that had protected the vehicle itself. The investigation team developed a systematic approach to searching for remains. This approach combined traditional archaeological techniques with modern forensic methods and underwater investigation procedures. The area around the original location of the vehicle was treated as an archaeological site, with careful documentation and systematic excavation of sediment layers. Archer Mayo, whose initial discovery had led to the breakthrough in the case, continued to play a crucial role in the search for remains. His intimate knowledge of the site and his advanced diving skills made him an invaluable member of the investigation team. Mayo's dedication to seeing the case through to completion aligned with the investigators' commitment to providing final answers to the Martin family questions. In August 2025, approximately 5 months after the vehicle recovery operations had concluded, Mayo made another critical discovery during a separate search operation he was conducting at the site. Working carefully through the sediment and debris that remained in the area where the vehicle had been found, Mayo located what appeared to be human remains within the vehicle's original location. The discovery of remains required an immediate shift in the investigation's focus and procedures. The site was treated as a potential crime scene, with appropriate protocols established for evidence collection and preservation. Forensic anthropologists were brought in to assist with the careful recovery and preliminary examination of the remains. The condition of the remains reflected their nearly 70 years of submersion in the river environment. Soft tissue had long since disappeared, leaving only skeletal remains that had been preserved in the sediment layers. However, the protective environment created by the deep burial had prevented the complete dispersal or destruction of the remains, providing investigators with material that could potentially be analyzed for identification purposes. The recovery of the remains was conducted with meticulous care. Each bone or bone fragment was carefully documented in place before being removed, photographed extensively, and properly preserved for further analysis. The surrounding sediment was also collected for later examination, as it might contain additional small bone fragments or other evidence. Preliminary field examination of the remains suggested that they represented more than one individual, which was consistent with the theory that Kenneth, Barbara Jean, and Barbie Martin had all been in the vehicle when it entered the water. However, definitive identification would require extensive laboratory analysis using modern forensic techniques. The discovery of the remains marked a significant emotional moment for everyone involved in the investigation. After decades of searching and uncertainty, physical evidence of the missing family members had finally been located. For the extended Martin family, the discovery represented the possibility of final closure after nearly 70 years of not knowing what had happened to their loved ones. However, the discovery also marked the beginning of what would be the most technically challenging phase of the investigation. Identifying skeletal remains that had been submerged for nearly 70 years would require the most advanced forensic techniques available, including DNA analysis that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with degraded biological material. The remains were transported to appropriate forensic facilities where they could be examined under controlled laboratory conditions. Forensic anthropologists began the process of analyzing the skeletal material to determine how many individuals were represented, their approximate ages and sexes, and any other information that might be gleaned from the bones themselves. Concurrently, preparations began for DNA analysis that would hopefully provide definitive identification. This analysis would require locating surviving family members who could provide reference samples for comparison, as well as applying the most advanced DNA extraction and analysis techniques to biological material that had been severely degraded by decades of submersion. The discovery of the remains also provided investigators with additional information about the circumstances of the Martin family's disappearance. The location and condition of the remains offered clues about how the vehicle had entered the water and what had happened to the occupants. However, detailed analysis would be required to develop a comprehensive understanding of the events of December 7, 1958. For Archer Mayo, the discovery of the remains represented the culmination of years of dedicated research and investigation. His persistence and methodical approach had not only located the Martin family vehicle but had also led to the recovery of the missing family members themselves. Mayo's success provided a powerful example of what could be accomplished through dedication, advanced technique, and refusal to accept that some mysteries could never be solved. The discovery phase of the Martin family investigation was now essentially complete. After nearly 70 years, all of the missing family members had been located. However, the most critical phase of the investigation still lay ahead, the scientific analysis that would provide definitive identification and hopefully final answers about what had happened to the Martin family on that December evening in 1958. The recovery of skeletal remains from the Columbia River site in August 2025 marked the beginning of the most technically sophisticated phase of the Martin family investigation. The challenge facing forensic scientists was formidable: to extract and analyze DNA from biological material that had been submerged in a river environment for nearly 70 years, material that had been subjected to decades of water action, temperature fluctuations, and biological degradation. Traditional DNA analysis techniques, while remarkably advanced compared to what had been available even a decade earlier, faced significant limitations when dealing with severely degraded biological material. The extended submersion of the Martin family remains in the Columbia River had created conditions that were particularly challenging for DNA preservation and recovery. Recognizing the unique challenges presented by the case, Oregon investigators made the decision to partner with OthRAM, a specialized forensic laboratory that had developed advanced techniques specifically for working with degraded DNA samples. OthRAM had established a reputation for solving cases that had previously been considered impossible due to the poor condition of available biological material. OthRAM's approach to DNA analysis differed significantly from traditional forensic DNA techniques. While conventional methods relied on analyzing specific regions of DNA that were known to be variable between individuals, OthRAM's techniques involved analyzing much larger portions of the genome, including regions that were more likely to survive degradation processes. The partnership with OthRAM represented the third time that Oregon investigators had utilized the company's services for cold case investigations. Previous collaborations had demonstrated the potential for OthRAM's techniques to solve cases that had been stalled for decades due to limitations in available evidence or analytical capabilities. The process of DNA extraction from the Martin family remains required extremely careful handling and specialized laboratory procedures. The skeletal material had to be processed to isolate any surviving DNA while avoiding contamination that could compromise the analysis. This process was particularly challenging given the age of the remains and their extended exposure to environmental conditions. OthRAM's scientists employed a multi-step process to maximize the chances of successful DNA recovery. Small samples of bone material were carefully cleaned and then processed using techniques designed to break down the mineral matrix of the bone while preserving any surviving organic material. The resulting extract was then subjected to multiple rounds of purification and concentration to isolate any DNA that might be present. The initial analysis revealed that while DNA was indeed present in the remains, it was severely fragmented and present in very low concentrations. This finding was not unexpected given the age and condition of the material, but it meant that the analysis would require the most advanced techniques available and would push the limits of what was currently possible in forensic DNA analysis. OthRAM's proprietary sequencing techniques were designed specifically to work with this type of challenging material. Rather than relying on the traditional PCR amplification methods used in most forensic DNA analysis, OthRAM employed next-generation sequencing techniques that could analyze thousands of DNA fragments simultaneously, even when individual fragments were too short or degraded for conventional analysis. The analysis process required several months of intensive laboratory work. Multiple attempts were made to extract and analyze DNA from different portions of the recovered remains, as the degree of preservation varied significantly between different bones and even different sections of individual bones. Each analysis attempt provided additional data that could be combined to build a more complete picture of the genetic profiles present in the remains. Concurrently with the DNA analysis, investigators worked to identify surviving family members who could provide reference samples for comparison. This process involved extensive genealogical research to trace the Martin family lineage and locate living relatives who shared genetic material with the missing family members. The genealogical research revealed several surviving relatives on both Kenneth and Barbara Jean Martin's sides of the family. These relatives were contacted and agreed to provide DNA samples that could be used for comparison with the recovered remains. The availability of multiple reference samples from different family lines would strengthen the reliability of any identifications that might be made. The comparison process involved sophisticated statistical analysis to determine the probability that the recovered remains came from individuals related to the Martin family reference samples. This analysis had to account for the uncertainties introduced by the degraded nature of the DNA and the potential for contamination or other analytical artifacts. By early 2026, the analysis had progressed to the point where preliminary results were available. The genetic profiles developed from the recovered remains showed strong statistical support for the conclusion that they belonged to individuals related to the Martin family. However, additional analysis and verification would be required before definitive identifications could be made. The complexity of the analysis was increased by the fact that remains from multiple individuals were present at the site. The DNA analysis had to not only establish family relationships but also determine which specific family members were represented by the recovered material. This process required careful comparison of the genetic profiles with known information about the ages, sexes, and family relationships of the missing individuals. The collaboration between Oregon investigators and Othram demonstrated the continuing evolution of forensic science and the potential for new techniques to solve cases that had previously been considered unsolvable. The success of the DNA analysis, despite the challenging condition of the biological material, provided proof of concept for applying similar techniques to other long-standing cold cases. As the analysis moved toward completion in the spring of 2026, investigators prepared for what would hopefully be the final phase of the Martin family investigation, the official announcement of identifications and the conclusion of a case that had spanned nearly 70 years and involved multiple generations of investigators, searchers, and family members who had never given up hope for answers. On April 16, 2026, nearly 68 years after the Martin family vanished into the Columbia River Gorge, investigators with the Oregon State Medical Examiner's Office made the announcement that had been anticipated for decades. The skeletal remains recovered from the submerged vehicle had been officially identified as belonging to Kenneth Martin, age 54, his wife Barbara Jean Martin, age 48, and their daughter Barbara, Barbie, Martin, age 14. The announcement represented the culmination of one of Oregon's longest-running missing persons investigations and marked the successful conclusion of a case that had challenged investigators across multiple generations. The identification process had required the application of the most advanced forensic techniques available, pushing the boundaries of what was possible with severely degraded biological material. Dr. Sarah Chen, Oregon's chief medical examiner, conducted the press conference announcing the identifications. Her presentation detailed the extensive scientific analysis that had been required to reach definitive conclusions about the identity of the remains. The process had involved multiple lines of evidence, including anthropological analysis of the skeletal remains, comparison with historical records and missing persons files, and most critically, advanced DNA analysis conducted in partnership with Othram. The anthropological analysis had provided supporting evidence for the identifications. The skeletal remains included individuals consistent with the ages and sexes of the missing Martin family members. While the extended submersion had prevented the preservation of many detailed characteristics that might have been available in more recent cases, sufficient information remained to support the genetic identification results. The official identification of the remains provided investigators with the information needed to reconstruct the basic facts of what had happened to the Martin family on December 7, 1958. The location where the remains were found, the condition of the recovered vehicle, and the circumstances of the discovery all pointed to a tragic accident rather than any criminal activity. Hood River County Sheriff Maria Rodriguez announced that the investigation had been concluded as a result of the positive identification. After extensive analysis of all available evidence, investigators had found no indication that a crime had been committed. The Martin family's disappearance appeared to have been the result of a traffic accident that had sent their vehicle into the Columbia River, where it had remained hidden for nearly 70 years. The conclusion that the case was accidental rather than criminal was based on multiple factors. The location where the vehicle was found was consistent with an accident scenario involving a vehicle leaving the Columbia River Highway and entering the water. The condition of the vehicle and the positioning of the remains provided no evidence of foul play or criminal activity. Furthermore, the extensive investigation conducted over the decades had never uncovered any evidence suggesting that the Martin family had been the victims of crime. Their disappearance appeared to have been sudden and unexpected, consistent with an accident rather than a planned departure or criminal act. The driving conditions on December 7, 1958, would have been challenging for travelers unfamiliar with the Columbia River Gorge area. Winter weather, potentially slick roads, and limited visibility could have contributed to an accident, particularly on the winding roads that characterize the scenic highway system in the area. The official conclusion of the case provided long-awaited closure for the extended Martin family. Surviving relatives, some of whom had lived their entire lives without knowing what had happened to Kenneth, Barbara Jean, and Barbie, finally had definitive answers about their loved one's fate. Margaret Williams, a niece of Barbara Jean Martin, spoke at the press conference about the family's reaction to the identification. She described the mixture of sadness and relief that family members felt upon learning that their decades of uncertainty had finally ended. While the confirmation of the family's deaths was tragic, the knowledge of what had happened provided a form of closure that had been absent for nearly 70 years. The successful resolution of the Martin family case also provided validation for the persistence and dedication of the many individuals who had worked on the investigation over the decades. From the original investigators in the 1950s to the independent searchers like Archer Mayo who had refused to give up, the case demonstrated the importance of maintaining hope and continuing to apply new technologies and techniques to cold cases. Archer Mayo, whose discovery of the submerged vehicle had been the key breakthrough in the case, was recognized at the press conference for his crucial contribution to solving the mystery. Mayo's methodical research, advanced diving skills, and unwavering dedication had finally provided the answers that had eluded investigators for nearly 7 decades. The Oregon Medical Examiner's Office announcement also highlighted the role that advanced forensic techniques had played in solving the case. The successful DNA analysis of severely degraded remains demonstrated the potential for modern science to solve cases that had previously been considered impossible due to the condition of available evidence. The partnership with Othram was specifically noted as a crucial factor in the successful identification. The company's specialized techniques for analyzing degraded DNA had made possible an identification that would have been impossible using conventional forensic methods. This success provided a model for applying similar techniques to other cold cases involving challenging biological evidence. The announcement marked the official end of active investigation into the Martin family disappearance, but it also represented the beginning of a new phase of recognition and remembrance. The family's story had become part of Oregon's history, a reminder of both the dangers posed by the state's natural environment and the persistence of human dedication to solving mysteries and providing closure. The case would continue to serve as a teaching tool for investigators, forensic scientists, and search and rescue organizations. The successful resolution demonstrated the importance of maintaining detailed records over long periods, the value of applying new technologies to old cases, and the crucial role that dedicated individuals could play in solving seemingly impossible mysteries. The successful resolution of the Martin family case after nearly 70 years provides a unique opportunity to examine how investigative techniques, forensic science, and search and rescue methods evolved over the decades. The case serves as a chronicle of advancement in every aspect of missing persons investigations, from the initial search methods of the 1950s to the sophisticated DNA analysis that finally provided definitive answers in 2026. When the Martin family first disappeared in December 1958, missing persons investigations relied primarily on traditional police work, interviewing witnesses, searching likely locations, and coordinating with other agencies to distribute information about the missing individuals. The tools available to investigators were limited by the technology of the era, and many techniques that would later become standard were not yet available. The initial search for the Martin family employed methods that were typical for the late 1950s. Ground teams conducted systematic searches of areas along the Columbia River Highway and in locations where the family might have encountered difficulties. These searches were labor-intensive and relied heavily on visual observation, as electronic detection methods were primitive or non-existent. The discovery of Virginia and Susan Martin's bodies in the river in 1959 provided investigators with their first concrete evidence about what had happened to the family. However, the investigative tools available for analyzing this evidence were limited. Modern forensic pathology was still in its early stages, and many of the techniques that would later be used to determine causes of death and reconstruct accident scenarios were not yet developed. The underwater search efforts conducted in the years following the discovery of the two daughters' bodies represented the best available technology of their time, but these efforts were severely limited by the equipment and techniques available. Early diving equipment was cumbersome and dangerous, limiting the time that could be spent underwater and the areas that could be effectively searched. The introduction of scuba diving equipment in the 1960s revolutionized underwater search capabilities, but even these improved techniques faced significant limitations in the challenging environment of the Columbia River. The strong currents, poor visibility, and complex underwater topography made systematic searching extremely difficult, even with improved diving technology. The development of sonar technology in the 1970s and 1980s provided new capabilities for underwater searching. Early sonar systems allowed investigators to create rough maps of underwater topography and identify objects that might warrant closer investigation. However, these early systems had limited resolution and were not effective at detecting objects buried under sediment. The evolution of sonar technology continued through the 1990s and 2000s, with side-scan sonar systems providing increasingly detailed images of underwater environments. These systems could detect objects that would not be visible to divers and could cover large areas more efficiently than traditional search methods. However, even advanced sonar systems had limitations, particularly when searching for objects that had been buried under decades of sediment accumulation. The development of GPS technology revolutionized the ability to accurately map and coordinate search efforts. Earlier search operations had relied on relatively crude mapping techniques that made it difficult to ensure comprehensive coverage of search areas or to avoid unnecessary duplication of effort. GPS allowed for precise mapping of searched areas and much more efficient coordination of multiple search teams. Computer modeling became increasingly important in missing persons investigations as processing power increased and software became more sophisticated. By the 2000s, investigators could use computer models to analyze factors such as water flow patterns, weather conditions, and terrain characteristics to predict where missing vehicles or remains might be located. The rise of forensic archaeology brought new techniques to missing persons investigations, particularly in cases involving the recovery of remains that had been buried or hidden for extended periods. Archaeological methods for systematic excavation, documentation, and evidence preservation proved valuable in cases like the Martin investigation, where remains had to be recovered from complex underwater sediment layers. Advances in forensic anthropology provided investigators with much more sophisticated tools for analyzing skeletal remains. Modern forensic anthropologists can determine not only basic characteristics such as age, sex, and stature, but can also identify evidence of trauma, disease, and other factors that might be relevant to understanding the circumstances of death. The most dramatic advances in cold case investigation came in the field of DNA analysis. When the Martin family disappeared in 1958, DNA had not yet been identified as the carrier of genetic information. By the time their remains were recovered in 2025, DNA analysis had become the gold standard for human identification and had evolved to the point where meaningful results could be obtained from severely degraded biological material. The partnership with Othram represented the cutting edge of forensic DNA analysis. Traditional forensic DNA techniques, developed primarily for fresh biological samples, had significant limitations when applied to degraded material. Othrum's techniques, based on next-generation sequencing technology, could extract genetic information from samples that would have been unusable with conventional methods. The evolution of genealogical research techniques also played a crucial role in the successful resolution of the Martin case. Modern genealogical databases and research methods made it much easier to locate surviving family members who could provide reference samples for DNA comparison. Online resources and collaborative genealogical research had revolutionized the ability to trace family lineages and identify appropriate individuals for genetic comparison. The role of independent searchers and volunteer investigators evolved significantly over the decades as well. Early volunteer efforts were often poorly coordinated and sometimes interfered with official investigations. However, by the time Archer Mayo began working on the Martin case, independent searchers had developed sophisticated methodologies and often possessed specialized skills and equipment that complemented official investigation efforts. The Internet revolutionized the ability of independent researchers to collaborate and share information. Online databases, discussion forums, and mapping tools provided amateur investigators with resources that had previously been available only to professional law enforcement agencies. This democratization of information and tools enabled dedicated individuals like Mayo to conduct research and analysis that rivaled or exceeded what official agencies could accomplish with limited resources. The successful resolution of the Martin family case demonstrated how the integration of traditional investigative methods with cutting-edge technology could solve cases that had seemed impossible for decades. The combination of historical research, advanced diving techniques, sophisticated recovery methods, and breakthrough DNA analysis created a powerful toolkit for cold case investigation that would serve as a model for future investigations. The Columbia River Gorge, where the Martin family met their tragic fate in December 1958, is far more than just the backdrop to a single mystery. This dramatic landscape, carved over millions of years by the Columbia River as it cuts through the Cascade Mountains, has been the site of numerous tragedies, mysteries, and remarkable stories of human persistence in the face of nature's power. Understanding the gorge's geography, geology, and history is essential to comprehending both why the Martin family's vehicle remained hidden for nearly 70 years and why their case was ultimately solvable when so many other mysteries in the area remain unsolved. The gorge is a place where the forces of nature operate on a scale that can easily overwhelm human efforts, yet it is also a place where human ingenuity and determination have achieved remarkable successes. The Columbia River Gorge stretches for approximately 80 miles, from the Sandy River east of Portland to the Deschutes River near the Dalles. The gorge averages about 4,000 feet in depth, creating a dramatic canyon that exposes geological formations spanning millions of years. The river itself varies in width from less than a mile in some locations to more than 4 miles in others, with depths that can exceed 200 feet in some areas. The geological history of the gorge provides crucial context for understanding how vehicles, remains, and other objects behave when they enter the river system. The gorge was formed primarily by massive floods that occurred at the end of the last ice age, approximately 15,000 years ago. These floods, known as the Missoula floods, were caused by the repeated breaking of ice dams that held back glacial Lake Missoula in what is now Montana. The Missoula floods carved the basic shape of the gorge in a matter of days or weeks, moving volumes of water that dwarf even the largest rivers in the modern world. The floods scoured the landscape down to bedrock in many areas, creating the complex topography of deep pools, rocky shelves, and sediment-filled basins that characterizes the river bottom today. This geological legacy created an underwater environment that is extraordinarily complex and challenging for search operations. The river bottom includes areas of solid basalt bedrock where objects cannot become buried, deep sedimentary basins where vehicles can disappear completely under accumulated debris, and complex rock formations that create unique flow patterns and deposition zones. The modern Columbia River system has been significantly modified by human activity, particularly the construction of dams for hydroelectric power generation and flood control. The Bonneville Dam, completed in 1938, is located downstream from the area where the Martin family vehicle was found. This dam created a reservoir that extends upstream past the location of the Martin accident, fundamentally altering the river's flow patterns and sediment deposition characteristics. The creation of the Bonneville Reservoir changed the river from a free-flowing system with significant seasonal variations in water level to a more stable system with controlled water levels. However, this stabilization also meant that objects entering the water after 1938 would behave differently than objects that entered the river in earlier periods, when seasonal floods might have moved them significant distances. The Martin family's accident occurred 20 years after the completion of Bonneville Dam, meaning that their vehicle entered a river system that was already significantly modified from its natural state. The controlled water levels and altered flow patterns created by the dam system may actually have contributed to the vehicle remaining in a relatively stable location rather than being carried downstream, as might have happened in the pre-dam river system. The Columbia River Gorge has been the site of numerous vehicle accidents over the decades, many involving vehicles leaving the roadway and entering the water. The Columbia River Highway, particularly in its original configuration from the early 20th century, included many sections where the roadway ran very close to steep drops into the river. Guard rails were minimal or non-existent in many areas, and the combination of challenging weather conditions and unfamiliar territory created significant hazards for drivers. Weather conditions in the gorge can change rapidly and dramatically, creating hazards that may not be apparent to drivers unfamiliar with the area. The gorge acts as a wind tunnel, with air masses moving between the Pacific Ocean and the interior of the continent creating strong and unpredictable wind conditions. Ice storms are common in winter, creating extremely hazardous driving conditions that can develop rapidly. Fog is another significant hazard in the gorge, particularly during the winter months when the Martin family made their final journey. Temperature inversions can create dense fog that reduces visibility to near zero within a matter of minutes. Drivers can find themselves completely disoriented, unable to see the roadway ahead or the edges of the road, creating conditions that have led to numerous accidents over the years. The history of the Columbia River Gorge includes numerous cases of missing persons and unexplained disappearances. The combination of challenging terrain, unpredictable weather, and the proximity of deep water has created conditions where people can vanish without a trace. Some of these cases have been solved over the years, often through the kind of persistent investigation and technological advancement that ultimately resolved the Martin family case. However, many mysteries in the gorge remain unsolved. The river has claimed numerous victims over the decades, and not all of them have been recovered. The same factors that kept the Martin family vehicle hidden for nearly 70 years continue to conceal other vehicles, remains, and evidence related to various incidents and accidents in the area. The success of Archer Mayo and the investigation team in locating and identifying the Martin family remains has implications for other cold cases in the Columbia River Gorge. The techniques and technologies that proved successful in the Martin case could potentially be applied to other long-standing mysteries in the area, providing hope that additional cases might be resolved in the future. The Martin family case also highlights the importance of understanding local environmental conditions when investigating missing persons cases in challenging natural environments. The specific characteristics of the Columbia River system, including its flow patterns, sediment deposition, and seasonal variations, were crucial factors in both the initial disappearance of the family and the eventual successful recovery of their remains. For current and future investigators working in the Columbia River Gorge, the Martin case provides valuable lessons about the persistence required for success in such challenging environments. The case demonstrates that even mysteries that have remained unsolved for decades may still yield to the right combination of dedication, technology, and understanding of the natural forces that shape the landscape where the mysteries occurred. The successful resolution of the Martin family case in April 2026 marked not just the end of one of Oregon's longest-running mysteries, but the beginning of a new understanding of what is possible in cold case investigation. The case's resolution after nearly 70 years provides profound lessons about persistence, technological advancement, and the enduring human need for answers and closure. For the surviving members of the Martin family, the identification of Kenneth, Barbara Jean, and Barbie's remains brought a complex mixture of emotions. The confirmation of their loved ones' deaths was, of course, tragic, but it also provided something that had been missing for nearly 7 decades, certainty. The family could finally grieve properly, hold memorial services, and begin the process of healing that had been impossible while their fate remained unknown. Margaret Williams, representing the extended Martin family at the final press conference, spoke eloquently about the family's journey through nearly 70 years of uncertainty. She described how different family members had coped with the not knowing in different ways. Some had held on to hope that Kenneth, Barbara Jean, and Barbie might somehow still be alive, perhaps having started new lives somewhere far from Oregon. Others had accepted early on that the family had likely died in an accident but struggled with the lack of closure that comes from not knowing what had happened or where their loved ones rested. The resolution of the case allowed the family to finally lay their loved ones to rest. Plans were made for a memorial service that would honor not just the 3 family members whose remains had been identified, but also Virginia and Susan, whose bodies had been recovered in 1959. For the first time since December 1958, the entire Martin family would be remembered together, their tragic story finally complete. The case's resolution also had profound implications for the broader field of cold case investigation. The successful application of advanced DNA analysis techniques to severely degraded remains that had been submerged for nearly 70 years established new benchmarks for what was possible in forensic identification. The partnership between Oregon investigators and Othram demonstrated the value of combining traditional investigative methods with cutting-edge scientific techniques. The Martin case became the 3rd successful resolution in Oregon involving Othram's specialized DNA analysis capabilities, establishing a pattern that suggested many other cold cases might be solvable using similar techniques. Law enforcement agencies throughout the Pacific Northwest began reviewing their own cold case files, identifying cases where severely degraded biological evidence might warrant reanalysis using advanced techniques. Archer Mayo's role in solving the case provided inspiration for other independent searchers and cold case enthusiasts. Mayo's success demonstrated that dedicated individuals, working with systematic methodology and advanced equipment, could make contributions to cold case resolution that rivaled or exceeded what official agencies could accomplish with limited resources spread across numerous active cases. Mayo's approach to the case, combining exhaustive historical research with advanced diving techniques and sophisticated underwater detection equipment, became a model for other independent investigators. His success also highlighted the importance of coordination between independent searchers and official law enforcement agencies, showing how collaboration could amplify the effectiveness of both professional and volunteer efforts. The technological aspects of the Martin case resolution had implications extending far beyond a single investigation. The successful recovery of a vehicle that had been buried under sediment for nearly 70 years demonstrated new possibilities for underwater archaeology and recovery operations. The techniques developed for the Martin recovery could be applied to other submerged archaeological sites, shipwrecks, and evidence recovery operations. The DNA analysis conducted by Othram pushed the boundaries of what was possible with degraded biological material, establishing new protocols and techniques that could be applied to other challenging cases. The success with the Martin remains, despite their extended submersion and degradation, proved that meaningful genetic profiles could be obtained from biological material that would have been considered hopeless using conventional techniques. The case also contributed to the growing understanding of how environmental factors affect the preservation and recovery of evidence in missing persons cases. The specific conditions that had preserved the Martin family vehicle and remains while keeping them hidden for decades provided valuable data for investigators working in similar environments. The Columbia River Gorge's role in the case highlighted the importance of understanding local environmental conditions when investigating missing persons cases. The successful resolution of the Martin case provided a template for approaching other mysteries in the gorge and similar environments throughout the Pacific Northwest. The institutional memory aspects of the case were equally significant. The Martin family investigation spanned multiple generations of investigators, with information and insights being passed down through decades of law enforcement personnel. The institutional memory aspects of the case were equally significant. The Martin family investigation spanned multiple generations of investigators, with information and insights being passed down through decades of law enforcement personnel. The case became a teaching tool for understanding how to maintain investigative continuity over extended periods, demonstrating the critical importance of detailed record-keeping and institutional knowledge preservation. Detective Captain James Morrison, who had worked on the Martin case during 3 different decades of his career, reflected on how the case had shaped his understanding of cold case methodology. Morrison had first encountered the case as a young patrol officer in the 1980s, had supervised search efforts during the 1990s, and had coordinated with independent searchers like Mayo during the 2000s and 2010s. His perspective illustrated how the case had evolved through multiple generations of investigative techniques and technologies. Morrison described how the case had influenced training protocols for new investigators in the Hood River County Sheriff's Office. The Martin case was used as an example of how seemingly impossible cases could be solved through persistence, technological advancement, and collaboration between official agencies and dedicated independent researchers. New investigators learned about the importance of maintaining open minds about old cases and the value of periodically revisiting cold cases as new techniques became available. The case also influenced search and rescue protocols throughout the Pacific Northwest. The successful recovery of the Martin family vehicle and remains provided valuable data about the effectiveness of different search techniques in river environments. Search and rescue organizations incorporated lessons learned from the Martin case into their training programs and operational procedures. Dr. Michael Chen, a forensic anthropologist who had worked on the Martin case during the final identification phase, discussed how the case had contributed to the broader understanding of taphonomic processes in aquatic environments. Taphonomy, the study of how remains change over time after death, was crucial to understanding how the Martin family remains had been preserved despite their extended submersion. The Martin case provided unique data about how human remains behave in river environments over extended periods. The specific conditions that had preserved skeletal material while allowing soft tissue to decompose completely offered insights that could be applied to other cases involving aquatic environments. This research contributed to the development of more accurate models for predicting how remains might be preserved or dispersed in similar circumstances. The successful DNA analysis from the Martin remains also contributed to the broader field of ancient DNA research. While the Martin remains were not truly ancient in archaeological terms, the challenges involved in extracting genetic information from severely degraded material shared many similarities with those faced by researchers working with much older specimens. Techniques developed for the Martin case could potentially be applied to archaeological and paleontological specimens where DNA preservation was marginal. The case's resolution had economic implications as well. The successful application of advanced forensic techniques to a decades-old case demonstrated the potential return on investment in cold case investigation. While the resources required for the Martin investigation were substantial, the resolution provided closure for multiple families and demonstrated the effectiveness of investing in advanced investigative capabilities. Insurance companies and legal professionals also took note of the Martin case resolution. The definitive identification of the remains and the conclusion that the deaths were accidental rather than criminal had implications for outstanding insurance claims and estate matters that had remained unresolved for nearly 70 years. The case provided a model for how advanced forensic techniques could be used to resolve long-standing legal questions. The Martin case also influenced public policy discussions about missing persons investigations and cold case resources. The successful resolution after nearly 70 years demonstrated the value of maintaining active cold case programs and investing in advanced forensic capabilities. Policymakers began to consider how similar resources might be applied to other long-standing missing persons cases. The case contributed to discussions about the role of independent researchers in law enforcement investigations. Archer Mayo's success demonstrated the potential value of collaboration between professional investigators and dedicated amateur researchers. However, the case also highlighted the importance of proper coordination and oversight to ensure that independent research efforts supported rather than interfered with official investigations. The Martin family case became part of the curriculum at several criminal justice and forensic science programs. Students studying cold case methodology, forensic anthropology, and DNA analysis learned about the case as an example of how persistence, technological advancement, and interdisciplinary collaboration could solve seemingly impossible mysteries. The case also influenced public understanding of forensic science capabilities and limitations. Media coverage of the resolution helped educate the public about the complexities involved in forensic identification and the challenges faced by investigators working with severely degraded evidence. This educational aspect was particularly important in an era when popular media often presented unrealistic portrayals of forensic science capabilities. The international forensic science community also took note of the Martin case resolution. The successful DNA analysis from severely degraded remains that had been submerged for nearly 70 years represented a significant technical achievement that had implications for similar cases worldwide. Researchers from other countries began to explore how the techniques used in the Martin case might be applied to their own challenging identification cases. The case influenced the development of new protocols for evidence preservation in missing persons investigations. The fact that the Martin family vehicle and remains had been preserved for nearly 70 years, despite being submerged in a river environment, provided valuable data about the conditions under which evidence might survive for extended periods. This information was incorporated into guidelines for evidence recovery and preservation in similar environments. The psychological impact of the case's resolution extended beyond the Martin family to include the broader community of investigators, searchers, and others who had been involved in various aspects of the investigation over the decades. Many individuals had devoted significant portions of their careers or personal time to the case, and the successful resolution provided validation for their efforts and dedication. Retired Detective Sarah Thompson, who had worked on the case during the 1970s and 1980s, described the emotional impact of learning about the case's resolution. Thompson had spent years coordinating search efforts and following up on tips related to the Martin family disappearance. The confirmation that the family had been found and identified provided a sense of professional completion that she had thought she might never experience. The case resolution also had implications for other families dealing with long-term missing persons cases. The Martin family's success in obtaining answers after nearly 70 years provided hope for other families who have been waiting for decades for information about their missing loved ones. Support groups for families of missing persons used the Martin case as an example of why it was important to never give up hope. The technological legacy of the Martin case extended to the development of new underwater search and recovery techniques. The methods used to locate and recover the Martin family vehicle in the challenging environment of the Columbia River provided a foundation for developing improved techniques for similar operations. Equipment manufacturers began incorporating lessons learned from the Martin recovery into the design of new underwater search and recovery systems. The case also influenced the development of new training programs for underwater recovery specialists. The unique challenges presented by the Martin vehicle recovery, including the extreme burial under sediment and the structural deterioration of the vehicle, provided valuable training scenarios for specialists who might face similar challenges in future operations. Academic researchers studying missing persons cases and cold case methodology incorporated the Martin case into their research programs. The case provided a unique example of how multiple factors, including technological advancement, investigative persistence, and environmental conditions, had combined to enable the resolution of a seemingly impossible case. The Martin case also contributed to discussions about resource allocation in law enforcement agencies. The successful resolution demonstrated the potential value of investing in cold case investigation capabilities, but it also highlighted the significant resources required for such investigations. Administrators began to develop more sophisticated approaches to prioritizing cold case investigations based on the likelihood of successful resolution and the resources required. As the Martin family case moved from active investigation to historical precedent, it began to take its place among the landmark cases that had shaped the development of modern forensic science and cold case investigation techniques. The case joined other famous investigations in providing a template for how persistence, technological innovation, and interdisciplinary collaboration could overcome seemingly impossible challenges. The case's influence on popular culture also began to emerge. True crime writers, documentary filmmakers, and other media professionals began to explore the Martin family story as an example of how real-life cold case investigations differed from fictional portrayals. The case provided an opportunity to educate the public about the realities of long-term missing persons investigations and the complexities involved in forensic identification work. The Martin family case ultimately became more than just a resolved mystery. It became a symbol of human persistence in the face of seemingly impossible challenges, a demonstration of how technological advancement could unlock solutions to long-standing problems, and a reminder that even the oldest mysteries might still yield to the right combination of dedication, expertise, and scientific capability. As we reach the end of this remarkable journey through nearly 70 years of mystery, searching, and ultimate resolution, we are reminded of the profound power of human persistence and the relentless march of scientific progress. The Martin family's story began on a winter evening in 1958 with a simple decision to take a family drive through one of Oregon's most beautiful landscapes. It ended in 2026 with cutting-edge DNA analysis and the kind of forensic detective work that would have seemed like science fiction to the original investigators. Tonight, as the Columbia River continues its ancient flow through the gorge, carving its path just as it has for millennia, we can find solace in knowing that the secrets it held so closely for nearly 7 decades have finally been revealed. Kenneth, Barbara Jean, and Barbie Martin can finally rest in peace, their story complete, their fate no longer a source of endless questions and sleepless nights for those who loved them. The resolution of their case stands as testament to everyone who refuses to let mysteries remain unsolved, who believes that every person deserves to be found, to be identified, to be remembered. From the original investigators who never closed the file, to Archer Mayo who spent years diving into dark waters searching for answers, to the scientists at Othram who pushed the boundaries of what was possible with damaged DNA. Each played a crucial role in bringing this family home. In the end, the Martin family case reminds us that time may pass, technologies may advance, and generations may change, but the human need for answers, for closure, for truth, remains constant. Some stories take decades to reach their conclusion, but the most important ones are always worth the wait. Sleep well, knowing that even in our darkest mysteries, there are always those who continue searching for the light. If you're still awake after that, subscribe, leave a like, and drop a comment. Which case should we cover next?